Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the shadows of one of mythology's most feared figures, only to discover that the monster we've been taught to fear was once a woman, whose only crime was existing in a world ruled by gods who took what they wanted and punished those who suffered for it. Tonight, we uncover the truth about Medusa, a story so tragic, so steeped in injustice, that it will forever change how you see the serpent-haired Gorgon, whose gaze could turn men to stone. Before we gaze into the eyes of one of mythology's most misunderstood figures, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is. Are you watching from a moonlit room in Tokyo at midnight, or perhaps from a cozy cafe in London as dawn breaks? And if you want to keep uncovering the stories history tried to bury, the myths that reveal uncomfortable truths about power and victimhood, subscribe to the channel, because this is only the beginning of our journey into the forgotten voices of the ancient world. For over 2,000 years, Medusa has haunted our collective imagination. She appears on ancient Greek pottery, carved into temple pediments, stamped on coins, and woven into the very fabric of Western storytelling. But somewhere between the ancient temples of Athens and the movie screens of Hollywood, her story became distorted, simplified, reduced to a cautionary tale about vanity or a monster to be slain by heroes. What we've lost, in translation, is perhaps the most important part of her story. Medusa was not born a monster. She was made one. Tonight, we'll trace the evolution of her myth from its earliest fragments to its most powerful reinterpretations, examining how a tale of divine punishment became a story of survival, how a victim became a villain, and how the most tragic figure in Greek mythology became a symbol of feminine rage that still resonates today. This is not just the story of a woman with snakes for hair. This is the story of how power works, how trauma is transferred, and how the wounded become weapons in the hands of those who wound them. To understand Medusa's tragedy, we must first understand what she was before she became what we fear. In the earliest whispers of Greek mythology, before Homer sang of heroes and Hesiod catalogued the gods, there existed older stories, older truths carved into stone and passed down through generations of priestesses and storytellers. The name Medusa comes from the ancient Greek word Medusa, meaning guardian or protectress. This is our first clue that the Medusa we know today, the monster whose gaze turns flesh to stone, is not the Medusa who existed in the beginning. She was not born with serpents for hair and death in her eyes. She was born beautiful, so beautiful that poets would compare her to the goddesses themselves. But to truly understand who Medusa was, we must venture even deeper into the archaeological and mythological record, into the pre-Olympian religious traditions that shaped the earliest understanding of divine feminine power in the Mediterranean world. Long before Zeus claimed dominance over the heavens, long before the patriarchal pantheon of classical Greek mythology crystallized into the forms we recognize today, there existed goddess-centered religious practices that revered the feminine as the source of wisdom, fertility, and protective power. In these ancient traditions, the serpent was not a symbol of evil or temptation, as later Judeo-Christian traditions would portray it, but rather a sacred creature associated with the earth's regenerative power, with healing, with the mysteries of life and death. Archaeological evidence from Minoan Crete, from the goddess temples of Anatolia, from the sacred sites scattered across the pre-classical Mediterranean, shows us images of priestesses and goddesses crowned with serpents, their arms raised in blessing, their faces serene with divine authority. The Medusa who emerges from these older traditions was likely a powerful priestess queen, possibly even a goddess herself in earlier incarnations of the myth. Her serpentine hair would have marked her not as cursed but as chosen, not as monstrous but as sacred, not as dangerous but as divine. The snakes that would later be seen as symbols of her corruption were originally symbols of her connection to the deepest mysteries of existence, to the cycles of death and rebirth that governed all life. Archaeological excavations have uncovered countless examples of what scholars call Medusa-type figures in pre-classical art. Female faces surrounded by snakes, often with wings, always with expressions of power and authority rather than terror. These images, found on pottery, jewelry, temple reliefs, and household shrines, suggest that the Medusa archetype was once widely revered rather than feared, worshipped rather than hunted. According to most versions of the myth, Medusa was one of three sisters known as the Gorgons. But unlike her sisters Steno and Euryale, who were born immortal and monstrous, Medusa was mortal and breathtakingly beautiful. She served as a priestess in Athena's temple, one of the most sacred positions a woman could hold in ancient Greece. This was not a role given lightly. Priestesses of Athena were chosen for their purity, their wisdom, and their dedication to the goddess of wisdom and war. But the selection process for becoming a priestess of Athena was rigorous and mystical, involving years of preparation and training that most modern people cannot fully comprehend. These women were not simply religious functionaries, but living conduits between the human and divine realms, trained in ancient mysteries that have been lost to time. They learned to interpret omens, to channel divine wisdom, to perform rituals that could influence the fate of entire cities. Medusa would have begun her training as a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, selected for her intelligence, her spiritual sensitivity, and yes, her beauty, which was seen as a reflection of divine favor. She would have spent years learning the sacred songs, the ritual movements, the proper way to tend the eternal flame that burned in Athena's honor. She would have memorized genealogies of gods and heroes, learned the properties of sacred herbs and oils, mastered the art of reading divine signs in the flight of birds, the patterns of smoke, the entrails of sacrificial animals. The daily life of a priestess was structured around sacred rhythms that connected her to the cosmic order. She would rise before dawn to kindle the sacred fire, would spend hours in meditation and prayer, would tend to the offerings brought by worshippers, would provide counsel to those seeking divine guidance. Her body belonged not to herself, but to the goddess she served. Her thoughts, her words, her very dreams were understood to be channels through which Athena might speak to the mortal world. Imagine, if you will, the marble halls of Athena's temple, the sacred space where Medusa spent her days in prayer and service, the morning light filtering through columns carved by master craftsmen, each detail planned to create an atmosphere of divine presence. The scent of burning olive oil from the sacred flame, mixed with the fragrance of incense imported from distant lands. The quiet rustle of her ceremonial robes, woven from the finest linen and dyed in sacred colors, as she moved through her daily rituals with the grace of one who had spent years perfecting every gesture. The temple itself was a masterpiece of architecture and spiritual engineering, designed not just to house the goddess's cult statue, but to create a space where the divine presence could manifest most fully. Every proportion was calculated according to sacred geometry. Every surface was adorned with scenes from Athena's mythology. Every sound was amplified and refined by acoustic principles that made even whispered prayers seemed to resonate with divine authority. Here was a young woman who had dedicated her life to something greater than herself, who had chosen the path of the sacred over the secular, who had vowed herself to a goddess who valued wisdom, strategy, and justice above all else. But the ancient world was not kind to beautiful women, especially beautiful women who served in temples, who walked alone through sacred spaces, who carried the protection of the gods, but not the protection of men. And there were always men watching, always men wanting, always men who believed that what they desired was theirs by right, regardless of vows or sanctity or the wishes of the women themselves. In some of the earliest artistic depictions of Medusa, she appears not as a monster but as a beautiful woman with wings, sometimes shown running or flying, her face turned away from the viewer. These images, found on ancient Greek pottery and metalwork, suggest a different story than the one we've inherited. They show us a Medusa in motion, a Medusa fleeing, a Medusa who might have been running from something terrible rather than pursuing it. The serpent imagery that would later define her was not originally a mark of monstrosity but of wisdom and protection. In ancient Mediterranean cultures, serpents were sacred symbols associated with healing, transformation, and feminine power. The snake that sheds its skin was seen as a creature of rebirth, of renewal, of the cyclical nature of life and death. To have serpents in your hair was not a curse but a crown, a symbol of your connection to the earth, to the mysteries of life, to the power that flows through all living things. But as Greek culture shifted from matriarchal religious practices to patriarchal political systems, these symbols of feminine power became symbols of feminine danger. The wise woman became the witch, the healer became the harmer, the protector became the monster. And Medusa, who had once been a guardian priestess crowned with the sacred serpents of wisdom, became a creature so horrible that to look upon her was death itself. To understand what happened to Medusa, we must first understand Poseidon, the god who had set her tragedy in motion. Poseidon was one of the most powerful deities in the Greek pantheon, ruler of the seas, brother to Zeus himself, a god whose temples dotted every coastline and whose favor sailors prayed for before every journey. But Poseidon was also a god defined by his appetites, his temper, and his absolute refusal to be denied anything he desired. In the complex hierarchy of the Greek pantheon, Poseidon occupied a position of tremendous power, but also of perpetual frustration. He was second only to his brother Zeus in authority, yet this second-place status gnawed at him constantly. Ancient sources tell us of his numerous attempts to overthrow Zeus, his bitter rivalries with other gods, his explosive rage when denied something he wanted. This was a deity whose very nature was tempestuous, whose moods could literally reshape the landscape, whose anger could sink ships and destroy cities. But perhaps more troubling than Poseidon's power was the way he wielded it, particularly in his relationships with mortal women. The ancient myths are filled with stories of his sexual conquests, euphemistically described as unions or affairs, but revealing a pattern of behavior that can only be understood as serial sexual assault. He raped Demeter while she was grieving. For her lost daughter Persephone, he assaulted Canes, then transformed her into a man so she could never be violated again. He pursued countless nymphs, ocean spirits, and mortal women, taking what he wanted regardless of their consent or desire. This pattern of behavior was not seen as criminal in the ancient world, but rather as a demonstration of divine prerogative. Gods were understood to be beyond mortal law, beyond human concepts of consent and propriety. Their desires were cosmic forces, as natural and unstoppable as earthquakes or tidal waves. When Poseidon wanted something or someone, the assumption was that he had every right to take it, and that mortals should consider themselves honored to be chosen by such a powerful deity. But this divine privilege masked a deeper truth about power and its abuse. Poseidon's pattern of sexual violence was not about desire or love or even lust in any meaningful sense. It was about dominance, about the demonstration of absolute power over those who could not resist him. Every assault was also an assertion of cosmic hierarchy, a reminder that gods could do whatever they wanted to mortals and face no consequences whatsoever. The ancient sources are often euphemistic about what exactly happened between Poseidon and Medusa, using words like lay with or knew that obscured the violence of the act. But reading between the lines of these ancient texts, examining the context and the aftermath, analyzing the patterns of Poseidon's behavior throughout mythology, the truth becomes clear. What happened in Athena's temple was not a seduction or a consensual encounter. It was rape, brutal and deliberate, and utterly without regard for Medusa's consent, her vows, or her sacred status. Picture the scene as it might have unfolded. Medusa alone in the temple, perhaps late at night or early. In the morning, when the sacred space was empty and quiet, she might have been tending the eternal flame, carefully feeding it with sacred oils and ensuring that its light never dimmed. Or she might have been preparing offerings for the dawn prayers, arranging fruits and flowers and incense in patterns prescribed by ancient tradition. Or perhaps she was simply spending time in contemplation before the massive gold and ivory statue of Athena that dominated the temple's inner sanctum, seeking guidance or simply enjoying the profound peace that came from being in the goddesses' presence. This was her sanctuary, her safe space, the place where she had dedicated her life to service and where she should have been under the protection of Athena herself. The temple was not just a building, but a sacred boundary, a space set apart from the ordinary world where different rules applied, where violence was forbidden, where those who served the gods should have been safe from the appetites and anger of mortals and immortals alike. Then Poseidon arrived. Perhaps he had been watching her for days or weeks or months, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect moment when she would be alone and vulnerable. Perhaps he had been planning this assault for some time, choosing his target carefully, savoring the anticipation of taking what belonged to his rival Athena. Or perhaps the attack was more spontaneous, driven by sudden desire and the absolute confidence that he could take what he wanted without consequence. Gods in Greek mythology rarely asked permission for anything, especially not from mortals, and most especially not from mortal women. They took what they wanted and called it their divine right. They rationalized their violence as love, their power as privilege, their crimes as the natural order of things. Poseidon saw Medusa and desired her, and in his mind, that desire was justification enough. But there may have been additional layers to Poseidon's choice of victim that make his crime even more calculated and cruel. Athena and Poseidon had a long history of rivalry, dating back to their competition for patronage of the city that would become Athens. Both gods had offered gifts to the people. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident and created a spring of water, while Athena planted an olive tree. The people chose Athena's gift as more useful, and the city was named in her honor. Poseidon never forgave this slight, and his assault on Medusa may have been as much about striking at Athena as it was about his desire for the priestess herself. From this perspective, Medusa was not just a victim of sexual violence, but a casualty in a divine power struggle that had nothing to do with her as an individual. She was chosen not for who she was, but for what she represented. Athena's sacred space, Athena's chosen servant, Athena's claim to wisdom and purity. By violating Medusa in Athena's own temple, Poseidon was sending a message to his rival that nowhere was truly safe from his reach, that even the most sacred spaces could be defiled if he chose to defile them. What happened next was a violation, not just of Medusa's body, but of everything she held sacred. The altar where she had made offerings every day for years was desecrated by violence. The floors where she had knelt in prayer were stained with her suffering. The very air that had been consecrated to the goddess of justice and wisdom was contaminated by an act of pure brutality and injustice. And Medusa, the victim of this assault, could do nothing to stop it. She was mortal, he was a god. She was bound by vows of service and purity. He was bound by nothing but his own desires. The power differential was absolute, the outcome inevitable. She may have cried out to Athena for protection, may have begged Poseidon to stop, may have fought with all her strength against an opponent whose power dwarfed her own. But none of it mattered. In those terrible moments, Medusa's life as she knew it ended, even though she didn't yet know what would replace it. The psychological trauma of what happened to Medusa cannot be overstated. She had dedicated her life to serving a goddess who represented justice, wisdom, and protection. She had believed that her vows, her purity, her sacred status would keep her safe. She had trusted in a divine order that promised that those who served faithfully would be protected by the gods they served. In the space of a few horrific minutes, all of these beliefs were shattered along with her body and her spirit. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of what happened was not the assault itself, but what it revealed about the world Medusa lived in. This was a world where women's bodies were not their own, where sacred spaces could be violated with impunity, where the powerful could abuse the powerless and face no consequences. It was a world where gods were praised for the same acts that would destroy mortals, where might made right and victims were blamed for their own suffering. In some versions of the myth, Medusa cried out during the assault, her screams echoing through the temple halls like the cries of a wounded animal. But who would help her? Who would dare stand against a god, even to protect an innocent priestess? Who would risk Poseidon's wrath to defend Medusa's honor? The answer, as it so often was in the ancient world, was no one. She suffered alone, in the very place where she should have been safest, violated by a god who would face no punishment. For his crime, the silence that followed her screams was as devastating as the violence itself. No one came running to help her. No divine intervention arrived to stop the assault. No righteous anger from Athena materialized to protect her servant. There was only Medusa, broken and alone, left to deal with the aftermath of trauma in a world that would blame her for what had been done to her. If Poseidon's crime was the spark that ignited Medusa's tragedy, then Athena's response was the fuel that made it burn. When the goddess of wisdom discovered what had happened in her temple, she was faced with a choice that would define not just Medusa's fate, but the moral landscape of Greek mythology itself. She could punish the god who had committed the crime, or she could punish the victim who had suffered it. In a decision that still reverberates through our understanding of justice and victim blaming, Athena chose to punish Medusa. To understand Athena's choice, we must understand the political and religious context of ancient Greece. Athena, despite being a goddess of wisdom and war, was still operating within a pantheon dominated by male deities. Zeus was king of the gods, and his brother Poseidon was too powerful to challenge directly. Divine politics, like human politics, often came down to who had more power, more allies, more ability to retaliate if crossed. Confronting Poseidon would have meant open conflict between two of the most powerful gods in the pantheon. So, Athena made a choice that prioritized political expediency over justice, divine hierarchy over mortal suffering. She could not punish her uncle without consequences, but she could punish a mortal priestess with impunity. She could restore the purity of her temple not by addressing the crime, but by removing the evidence of it. She could maintain her own position in the divine order by sacrificing the woman who had served her faithfully. The transformation of Medusa was not just a punishment, it was a masterpiece of cruel irony. Athena cursed Medusa with a face so hideous that anyone who looked upon her would turn to stone. Her beautiful hair, perhaps the very feature that had attracted Poseidon's unwanted attention, was replaced with writhing serpents. Her eyes, which had once reflected wisdom and compassion as a priestess, now carried death itself. Her very existence became a weapon that she could not control, a curse that made her dangerous to everyone around her. But the cruelest aspect of Athena's punishment was not just the physical transformation, it was the isolation it created. Medusa could no longer live among people, could no longer serve in the temple, could no longer have relationships or connections, or any of the things that make life worth living. She was condemned to exile, to loneliness, to an existence where her very presence brought death to anyone who encountered her. Think about the psychology of this curse. Medusa had been violated, traumatized, stripped of her agency and her safety. What she needed was healing, support, justice for the crime committed against her. Instead, she was given a punishment that compounded her trauma, that made her the dangerous one, that forced her to carry the burden of what had been done to her while also becoming a threat to everyone else. This is perhaps where Medusa's story becomes most relevant to our modern understanding of trauma and victim blaming. How often do we see survivors of assault blamed for what happened to them? How often are they asked what they were wearing, where they were walking, whether they fought back hard enough? How often are they made to feel that they are somehow contaminated by what was done to them, that they are now dangerous or damaged, or difficult to be around? Athena's curse was the ultimate expression of this twisted logic. Instead of addressing the source of the violence, she made the victim carry its consequences. Instead of protecting her priestess, she protected her own political position. Instead of seeking justice, she perpetuated injustice. And in doing so, she transformed a survivor into a monster. Not through any fault of Medusa's own, but through the cruelty of a system that values power over people, politics over principles, expediency over empathy. Some of these artistic works deliberately subvert the traditional iconography of Medusa, showing her with eyes that are sad rather than frightening, with snakes that seem protective rather than threatening, with an expression that speaks of wisdom earned through suffering, rather than mindless rage. These images invite viewers to see Medusa as she might have seen herself, not as the monster others made her into, but as the woman she remained beneath the curse. The fashion world has also embraced Medusa as a symbol of feminine power, with designers like Donatella Versace making the Gorgon's head the iconic logo of one of the world's most famous luxury brands. This commercial appropriation of Medusa's image, while sometimes criticized as superficial, also represents a cultural shift in how her story is understood. No longer is she simply a monster to be feared. She has become a symbol of strength, luxury, and feminine authority. After her transformation, Medusa was banished to the edges of the known world, to a place where her curse could harm no one, where her very existence would not disrupt the order of civilization. She was sent to live with her sisters, the other Gorgons, on a distant island surrounded by statues of stone, the remains of those unfortunate enough to have encountered her cursed gaze. Imagine the journey to that place of exile. Medusa, newly transformed, struggling to understand what had been done to her, learning through terrible trial and error that she could no longer look directly at anyone, that her very glance meant death. How many innocents died before she learned to keep her eyes cast down, to avoid mirrors, to navigate the world without seeing the faces of those around her. The island where she was banished has been described in various sources as a desolate place, rocky and barren, surrounded by the remnants of her victims. But what must it have been like for Medusa herself? She who had once served in the most beautiful temple in Athens, who had been surrounded by art and architecture and the community of fellow worshippers, now found herself in a place of exile and death. Her sisters, Steno and Euryale, were there to keep her company, but even they were changed by association with her curse. They had been born immortal and monstrous, but they had also been born together, a family unit that had never known separation or loss. Now they were united in exile, three sisters whose very existence was defined by the crime committed against one of them and the punishment that had followed. The psychological toll of this isolation cannot be overstated. Medusa had lost everything: her role as a priestess, her community, her ability to connect with other people, her very identity as a woman in the world. She had been transformed from a participant in society to an exile from it, from a person who contributed to the world to someone whose very presence was a threat to it. But perhaps even more devastating than the isolation was the knowledge of why it had happened. Medusa had not asked for any of this. She had not sought out Poseidon's attention, had not invited his assault, had not chosen to be cursed by Athena. She had simply existed as a beautiful woman in a world where beautiful women were prey, had simply tried to serve her goddess faithfully in a world where faithfulness offered no protection, had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the wrong god decided he wanted what she had no power to refuse. During her years of exile, what thoughts must have occupied Medusa's mind? Did she rage against the injustice of what had been done to her? Did she grieve for the life she had lost, the future that had been stolen from her? Did she dream of revenge against Poseidon, the god who had destroyed her life, or against Athena, the goddess who had punished her for being a victim? Or did she, like so many survivors of trauma, blame herself? Did she wonder if she had somehow brought this upon herself, if she had been too beautiful, too trusting, too naive? Did she internalize the message that Athena's punishment had sent, that she was somehow at fault for what had happened to her? Did she spend her days in exile, not just physically isolated, but emotionally imprisoned by shame and self-doubt? Statues that surrounded her island home tell their own story. Each one was a person who had looked upon her, someone who had perhaps come seeking the monster they had heard about in stories, or someone who had simply had the misfortune to encounter her by accident. But from Medusa's perspective, each statue was also a reminder of what she had become, a monument to her own involuntary capacity for destruction. These stone figures must have been her only companions, the only faces she could look upon without fear of causing death. But they were also accusations, silent witnesses to the terrible power that had been forced upon her. Did she speak to them, these frozen visitors? Did she apologize for what her curse had done to them? Did she see in their stone faces the reflection of her own trapped existence? Years passed, perhaps decades, and Medusa's story might have ended there, with her living out her cursed existence in exile, forgotten by the world that had cast her out. But Greek mythology rarely allows its monsters to simply exist. They must be defeated, their threats neutralized, their stories concluded with the triumph of heroes over the forces of chaos and darkness. Enter Perseus, the son of Zeus, a hero, whose own story began with divine intervention and mortal suffering. Like so many heroes in Greek mythology, Perseus was the product of Zeus's wandering eye and his ability to take what he wanted from mortal women. His mother Danae had been imprisoned by her father to prevent a prophecy from coming true. But Zeus had found a way to reach her, transforming himself into golden rain and impregnating her in what was yet another instance of divine assault, disguised as divine love. Perseus's quest to kill Medusa began not as a noble mission to rid the world of a monster, but as the result of his own youthful boasting and political maneuvering. He had rashly promised King Polydex that he would bring him the head of Medusa as a wedding gift, a promise made to protect his mother from the king's unwanted advances. In other words, Perseus's heroic quest was motivated not by justice or altruism, but by family drama and masculine pride. The gods, however, were eager to help Perseus succeed in his mission. Athena provided him with a polished shield that would allow him to see Medusa's reflection without looking directly at her. Hermes gave him winged sandals for swift travel and a sword sharp enough to cut through anything. Hades contributed a helmet of invisibility. The hero was armed not just with weapons, but with divine protection, ensuring that the outcome of his confrontation with Medusa was never really in doubt. But let us pause here and consider what this divine assistance really means. The same goddess who had cursed Medusa for being assaulted in her temple was now providing weapons to the hero who would kill her. The same pantheon that had allowed Poseidon to commit his crime with impunity was now eager to see its victim destroyed. The message was clear. Medusa's existence, even in exile, was still too much of a disruption to the divine order. She had to be eliminated. The preparations for Perseus's quest also involved consulting the Graeae, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them. These hag-like figures were forced to reveal the location of Medusa's island and provide information about how to defeat her. Even in seeking to kill Medusa, Perseus had to resort to trickery and coercion against other women, taking their shared eye hostage until they revealed what he wanted to know. As Perseus approached Medusa's island, guided by divine gifts and divine favor, he would have seen the evidence of her curse long before he saw her. The shoreline littered with stone ships and stone sailors. The beach covered with the statues of those who had sought her out over the years. Some might have been heroes like himself. Others might have been merchants, blown off course. Still others might have been curious visitors who had heard the stories and wanted to see the monster for themselves. But Perseus, protected by his divine gifts, was able to navigate through this graveyard of stone without becoming part of it. He could see Medusa's reflection in his polished shield, could approach her without meeting her deadly gaze, could position himself for the killing blow while remaining safely beyond the reach of her curse. The actual killing of Medusa is typically described in Greek sources as a swift, almost clinical affair. Perseus, guided by Athena's shield and protected by divine gifts, approached the sleeping Gorgon and severed her head with a single stroke of his magical sword. But if we slow down this moment, if we examine it not from the perspective of the hero, but from the perspective of the victim, the scene becomes infinitely more complex and tragic. Medusa, at the moment of her death, was asleep. This detail, often overlooked in retellings that focus on Perseus's heroism, is crucial to understanding the true nature of this encounter. She was not engaged in battle, not threatening innocent people, not rampaging through the countryside like some mindless monster. She was simply sleeping, perhaps dreaming of the life she had lost, perhaps finding in sleep the only escape from the nightmare her existence had become. The fact that Perseus struck while she slept also raises uncomfortable questions about the heroic nature of his act. What kind of hero kills a sleeping victim? What kind of courage does it take to murder someone who is unconscious and defenseless? The image of Perseus striking down the sleeping Medusa looks less like heroism and more like assassination, less like justice and more like execution. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Medusa's death is what it revealed about her true nature. According to most versions of the myth, when Perseus severed her head, two beings sprang from her blood: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a golden-sworded giant. These were the children of Poseidon, conceived during the assault that had led to her curse and carried within her body throughout all her years of exile. Think about what this means. For all those years of isolation, all those years of being feared and hated as a monster, Medusa had been pregnant with the children of her rapist. Her body had been forced to carry the evidence of her assault, to nurture the offspring of the god who had destroyed her life. Her exile had been not just a punishment, but a hidden pregnancy, her monstrous appearance, perhaps partly the result of divine gestation. This revelation transforms our understanding of Medusa's story in profound ways. Her isolation was not just about protecting the world from her curse, but about hiding a pregnancy that would have been evidence of Poseidon's crime. Her transformation might have been not just punishment, but a way of concealing what had been done to her. Her years of exile become not just banishment, but a forced and secret motherhood. When Perseus killed her, he was not just slaying a monster, but terminating a pregnancy, ending a life that had been shaped by trauma and defined by its consequences. The birth of Pegasus and Chrysaor from her blood was not a magical transformation, but a caesarean birth, the final violation of a woman whose body had never been truly her own. The image of Pegasus, the beautiful winged horse emerging from Medusa's blood, has inspired countless works of art and literature, but we rarely consider what it meant for Medusa herself to have carried this creature within her, to have been the unwilling mother of beauty while being seen as the embodiment of ugliness. We celebrate the birth of Pegasus without mourning the death of the woman who gave him life. Even in death, Medusa was not allowed to rest. Perseus took her severed head as a trophy, using it as a weapon in his subsequent adventures. Her dead eyes retained their power to turn living beings to stone, making her even more useful to the hero as a corpse than she had ever been allowed to be as a living woman. Her head became a tool of war, a symbol of Perseus's heroism, an object to be displayed and deployed whenever its power was needed. After killing Medusa, Perseus did not simply leave her body to rest in peace on the island where she had spent her years of exile. Instead, he severed her head and took it with him as both trophy and weapon, beginning a new chapter in her story that would see her image spread throughout the ancient world as a symbol of protection, power, and divine authority. The severed head of Medusa retained all the power of her living gaze. Anyone who looked directly upon it would still be turned to stone, making it an incredibly effective weapon in Perseus's subsequent adventures. He used it to rescue Andromeda from a sea monster, to defeat his enemies, and to prove his heroic status wherever he traveled. In death, Medusa had become more useful to the world than she had ever been allowed to be in life. But there is something profoundly disturbing about the way Perseus's triumph is celebrated in Greek mythology and art. Countless ancient vases, sculptures, and coins show the hero holding aloft Medusa's severed head, often with an expression of pride and accomplishment. These images, meant to celebrate Perseus's heroism, instead reveal the casual brutality with which the ancient world treated the suffering of women, especially women who had been transformed by trauma. Consider the visual symbolism at work here. A young man, blessed by the gods and armed with divine gifts, holding up the severed head of a woman who had been raped, cursed, and exiled for crimes she did not commit. The head itself, with its serpentine hair and horrifying visage, bears no resemblance to the beautiful priestess Medusa had once been. It is the face of trauma made manifest, of suffering transformed into weapon, of victimhood turned into a tool of power. The trajectory of Medusa's head after Perseus's initial adventures reveals even more about how the ancient world understood power and protection. Eventually, Perseus gave the head to Athena, the very goddess who had cursed Medusa in the first place. Athena then placed it on her aegis, the divine breastplate or shield that she wore into battle, making Medusa's image a permanent part of her divine regalia. This final appropriation of Medusa's image by Athena adds another layer of tragedy to her story. The goddess who had failed to protect her priestess from assault, who had punished the victim instead of the perpetrator, who had condemned Medusa to a life of exile and monstrosity, now claimed the power of that same woman's transformed face as her own divine authority. The symbol of Medusa's suffering became a symbol of Athena's power, but perhaps this appropriation was also a form of unconscious guilt, a recognition that Athena's treatment of Medusa had been unjust. By placing Medusa's image on her aegis, Athena was in some sense acknowledging the power that her former priestess had possessed, the authority that her suffering had granted her. The face that could turn enemies to stone became a face that protected Athena herself, suggesting that even the goddess recognized the strength that could emerge from surviving the UNSURVIVABL. The spread of Medusa's image throughout the ancient world as a protective symbol reveals another dimension of her story's resonance. Her face appeared on shields and armor, on the walls of houses and temples, on coins and jewelry. People who had never heard the full story of her transformation still recognized the power in her image, still felt that her terrifying visage could ward off evil and protect the innocent. In many of these artistic representations, Medusa's face loses some of its monstrous quality, becoming more stylized, more symbolic, more beautiful even in its frightening aspect. These later images suggest a cultural recognition that there was something more to Medusa than simple monstrosity, that her face carried not just the power to destroy, but the power to protect, not just the legacy of her curse, but the memory of her original divinity. As the centuries passed and Greek mythology evolved, Medusa's image began to take on meanings that went far beyond her original story. She became a symbol, an archetype, a figure whose power transcended the specific details of her myth and spoke to universal experiences of transformation, trauma, and the complex relationship between beauty and terror. In ancient art, Medusa's face underwent a fascinating evolution. The earliest depictions show her as genuinely monstrous, with bulging eyes, a protruding tongue, boar-like tusks, and writhing snakes for hair. These images emphasized her role as a creature to be feared, a monster whose very appearance was meant to inspire terror and revulsion. But as time progressed, artists began to portray Medusa differently. Her features became more human, more beautiful, more tragic. The snakes in her hair were rendered with greater elegance. Her face took on an expression of sorrow rather than rage. Her eyes began to suggest depth and intelligence rather than mindless malevolence. These artistic changes reflect a growing cultural understanding that Medusa's story was more complex than it initially appeared. The Romans, who inherited and adapted much of Greek mythology, were particularly drawn to Medusa as a protective symbol. Her image appeared on military standards, on public buildings, on personal jewelry and household items. The Romans understood that Medusa's power came not from evil but from having survived something terrible, and they wanted to harness that power for their own protection. This transformation of Medusa from monster to protector reveals something important about how societies process trauma and victimhood. Medusa's face became a way of acknowledging that sometimes the most powerful protectors are those who have suffered the most. That sometimes the greatest strength comes from surviving the greatest injustice. That sometimes the most effective shields are forged in the fire of the worst experiences. The psychological symbolism of Medusa has been analyzed by countless scholars and therapists over the centuries. Her serpentine hair has been interpreted as a symbol of wisdom, transformation, and the power of the feminine unconscious. Her deadly gaze has been seen as representing the power of the repressed to destroy the systems that oppress it. Her isolation has been understood as the isolation of all those who carry trauma, who find themselves cut off from normal social connection by the weight of what they have experienced. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Medusa's symbolism is the way it captures the double bind that many trauma survivors experience. Like Medusa, they are often seen as dangerous, difficult, damaged. Like Medusa, they may find that their survival strategies, the very things that help them endure, their trauma, are perceived as threatening by those around them. Like Medusa, they may discover that the world is more comfortable when they remain hidden, isolated, removed from normal social interaction. The image of Medusa looking at herself in a mirror, seeing her own transformed face, has become a powerful metaphor for the moment when trauma survivors confront the reality of how their experiences have changed them. The reflection in the mirror is both self and other, both familiar and strange, both the person they were and the person they have become. This symbolism has made Medusa a particularly resonant figure for feminist writers and thinkers, who have seen in her story a reflection of how patriarchal societies treat women, who have been victimized by the very systems that claim to protect them. Her transformation from beautiful priestess to terrifying monster mirrors the way that societies often transform victims into villains, survivors into threats, those who speak truth into those who must be silenced. The 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed a remarkable rehabilitation of Medusa's story, as feminist writers, scholars, and artists have reclaimed her narrative from the heroes who claimed to defeat her and the gods who claimed to judge her. These reinterpretations have revealed new layers of meaning in her myth, transforming her from a monster to be slain into a symbol of feminine power, resistance, and survival. One of the most influential of these reinterpretations came from the French feminist writer Hélène Cixous, who in her 1975 essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, transformed the Gorgon into a symbol of feminine writing and creative power. Cixous argued that Medusa's supposedly terrifying appearance was actually a projection of masculine fears about feminine sexuality and authority. When approached without fear, without the preconceptions imposed by patriarchal mythology, Medusa was revealed to be not monstrous but beautiful, not deadly but life-giving. You only have to look at the Medusa straight on to see her, Cixous wrote. And she's not deadly. she's beautiful and she's laughing. This radical reinterpretation challenged thousands of years of mythological tradition, suggesting that the real monster in Medusa's story was not the woman with snakes for hair, but the system that had transformed a victim into a villain. Contemporary feminist scholars have built upon Sixus's insights, examining Medusa's story as a paradigmatic example of victim blaming and the way that patriarchal societies punish women for the violence committed against them. They have pointed out that Medusa's transformation was not a natural or inevitable consequence of what happened to her, but a deliberate choice made by those in power to shift blame from perpetrator to victim. These scholars have also highlighted the way that Medusa's story functions as a warning to other women. This is what happens to those who are victimized. This is how society will treat you if you survive trauma. This is the isolation and monstrosity that awaits those who cannot, or will not remain silent about their experiences. From this perspective, Medusa's curse serves not just to punish her, but to control other women through fear. Modern retellings of Medusa's story have explored these themes with increasing sophistication and empathy. Writers like Pat Barker, Madeline Miller, and Jessie Burton have crafted narratives that center Medusa's own experience, giving voice to a character who had been silenced by centuries of Malathard mythology. These retellings often focus on Medusa's internal experience, her psychological journey from victim to survivor to something more complex and powerful. In these contemporary versions, Medusa's transformation is often portrayed not as a punishment, but as a kind of armor, a way of protecting herself in a world that has proven itself hostile to her existence. Her serpentine hair becomes a crown of power. Her deadly gaze becomes a weapon against those who would harm her. Her isolation becomes a form of sanctuary rather than exile. Some of these retellings have also explored the possibility that sisters, Steno and Euryale, chose their monstrous forms not as curses but as acts of solidarity, transforming themselves to accompany their sister in her exile. This interpretation emphasizes the importance of sisterhood and mutual support in surviving trauma, suggesting that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is to stand together, even in monstrosity. The visual arts have also participated in this feminist reclamation of Medusa's image. Contemporary artists have created paintings, sculptures, and installations that portray Medusa not as a monster, but as a powerful woman, a survivor, a force of nature. These works often emphasize her humanity, her beauty, her connection to the natural world through her serpentine hair. To fully understand why Medusa's story resonates so powerfully with modern audiences, we must examine it through the lens of contemporary psychology and trauma theory. What the ancient Greeks described in mythological terms, we now understand as the psychological and physiological effects of severe trauma, particularly sexual violence and systemic betrayal. Medusa's transformation can be read as a metaphor for how trauma literally changes people, altering not just their internal experience, but their relationship with the external world. Trauma survivors often report feeling like they have become different people, that the person they were before their traumatic experience no longer exists. Like Medusa, they may feel that they have been fundamentally transformed by what happened to them, that they are no longer recognizable even to themselves. The physical aspects of Medusa's curse, particularly her deadly gaze, can be understood as representing the hypervigilance and emotional dysregulation that often accompany severe trauma. Many survivors describe feeling like they are dangerous to be around, like their pain and anger might hurt those they care about. They may isolate themselves, not because they want to be alone, but because they fear the intensity of their own reactions. The unpredictability of their emotional responses. The serpents in Medusa's hair have been interpreted by some psychologists as representing the intrusive thoughts and memories that plague trauma survivors. Like snakes, these thoughts seem to have a life of their own, moving and writhing beyond conscious control, always present, always threatening to strike. The constant movement of the serpents mirrors the way trauma memories can never quite be stilled, never quite be tamed. Medusa's isolation on her distant island reflects the profound loneliness that many trauma survivors experience. They may find themselves cut off from their previous communities, unable to relate to people who haven't shared similar experiences, struggling to maintain connections that feel authentic and safe. The world of normal people can seem impossibly distant, as foreign as the mainland must have seemed to Medusa on her rocky exile. The statues that surrounded Medusa's island, the stone remains of those who had looked upon her, can be understood as representing the way trauma survivors often feel they have killed or damaged their relationships simply by existing in their post-trauma state. Each relationship that fails, each friendship that cannot survive the weight of their experience, becomes another statue in their personal landscape of isolation. But perhaps the most psychologically astute aspect of Medusa's myth is the way it captures the double victimization that many survivors experience. First, there is the original trauma, the assault by Poseidon. Then there is the secondary trauma of society's response, Athena's punishment and the world's rejection. This pattern, where survivors are blamed, punished, or ostracized for what was done to them, is tragically common in real-world responses to sexual violence. The concept of victim blaming that we understand today was already present in ancient Greek mythology, encoded in stories like the questions that Athena implicitly asked: why were you in the temple alone? Why didn't you fight back harder? Why didn't you scream louder? Are the same questions that survivors still face today. The assumption that the victim must have done something to deserve or invite their victimization is as old as storytelling itself. Modern therapeutic approaches to trauma emphasize the importance of helping survivors reclaim their narrative, to tell their own story rather than accepting the version imposed by others. From this perspective, the feminist reinterpretations of Medusa's myth are not just literary exercises, but psychological necessity. They represent the essential work of helping a character, and by extension, real survivors, move from victim to survivor to someone who can define their own meaning and purpose. The concept of post-traumatic growth, the idea that some people can emerge from trauma stronger and more empowered than they were before, is also reflected in some modern readings of Medusa's story. Her curse, while terrible, also gave her a kind of power that she had never possessed as a priestess. She became someone who could not be threatened, could not be approached without caution, could not be dismissed or ignored. In a world where women had little power, Medusa's curse was also a kind of terrible liberation. The themes embedded in Medusa's ancient story find disturbing parallels in contemporary society, making her myth not just a relic of the past, but a mirror for present day injustices. When we examine modern cases of sexual assault, victim blaming, and the treatment of survivors, we see the same patterns that played out in Athena's temple thousands of years ago. Consider the way our legal system often treats survivors of sexual assault. Like Medusa, they are frequently subjected to scrutiny that focuses more on their behavior than on that of their attackers. They are asked about their clothing, their drinking, their sexual history, their decision to be in certain places. At certain times, the implicit assumption is often that they must have done something to bring the assault upon themselves. that their victimization is somehow their fault. The concept of legitimate rape that has emerged in some political discourse echoes Athena's judgment of Medusa. If the assault doesn't fit certain narrow criteria, if the victim doesn't respond in expected ways, if there isn't enough physical evidence or witness testimony, then the assault is somehow less real, less worthy of justice, less deserving of sympathy. Like Medusa, modern survivors often find that their trauma is compounded by a system that questions their credibility and judges their worthiness. The isolation that Medusa experienced on her distant island finds parallels in the way many assault. Survivors are ostracized by their communities. They may be asked to leave organizations, schools, or social groups to avoid making others uncomfortable. They may find that their presence at events or gatherings is seen as disruptive, not because of anything they have done, but because their very existence reminds others of unpleasant realities they would prefer to ignore. Social media has created new forms of this isolation, where survivors who speak out about their experiences may face online harassment, doxing, and coordinated attacks that force them into digital exile. Like Medusa's deadly gaze, their truth-telling is seen as dangerous, something that must be contained or eliminated to preserve the comfort of others. The #MeToo movement has revealed how many powerful men, like Poseidon in Medusa's story, have been able to commit assault with impunity because of their positions in hierarchies that protect them. These men's victims, like Medusa, often find that the systems they trusted to protect them instead protect their assailants. The choice between challenging powerful perpetrators and punishing vulnerable victims continues to be made in favor of preserving existing power structures. The phenomenon of cancel culture, while complex and often misunderstood, sometimes functions like Athena's curse in reverse. Instead of punishing victims, it can sometimes punish perpetrators by making them untouchable, unmarketable, unable to participate in normal social and professional interactions. The parallel is not exact, but it demonstrates how the power of social ostracism, first wielded against Medusa, continues to be a tool for enforcing social norms and punishing those who violate them. Corporate responses to sexual harassment often mirror Athena's approach to Medusa's assault. Rather than addressing the systemic issues that allowed harassment to occur, companies may simply remove the victims through transfers, layoffs, or forced resignations. The message is clear. The problem is not the harassment, but the disruption caused by reporting it. The victim becomes the source of the problem that needs to be solved. Educational institutions face similar challenges when dealing with sexual assault cases. The pressure to protect the institution's reputation, to avoid difficult confrontations with powerful donors or prominent faculty members, to maintain the comfortable fiction that such things don't happen in their community, often leads to responses that prioritize institutional interests over survivor welfare. Like Athena protecting her political position in the pantheon, these institutions often choose the path that preserves their power rather than the path that serves justice. The way that survivors' trauma responses are pathologized and stigmatized also echoes Medusa's story. Survivors who develop PTSD, depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions as a result of their trauma may find themselves labeled as damaged, difficult, or unstable. Their trauma responses, the very evidence of what was done to them, become reasons to exclude them from opportunities, relationships, and communities. Despite the tragic elements of her story, Medusa has become a powerful symbol of reclamation and resistance in contemporary culture. Her image has been adopted by survivors, activists, and artists who see in her transformed face not monstrosity but strength, not curse but crown, not victim but warrior. This reclamation of Medusa's symbolism represents a broader cultural shift in how we understand trauma, survival, and the right to define one's own narrative, rather than accepting the version of her story told by her oppressors. Modern interpreters have chosen to center Medusa's own experience, to imagine what her story might look like if she were allowed to tell it herself. Survivor advocacy organizations have adopted Medusa's image as a symbol of the power that can emerge from surviving. Her serpentine hair is reinterpreted as a crown of wisdom, her deadly gaze as the power to stop those who would do harm, her isolation as a form of sacred solitude rather than punishment. These reinterpretations don't deny the trauma of her story, but refuse to let that trauma be the final word. The therapeutic concept of survivor wisdom is embodied in these new readings of Medusa's myth. Survivors of trauma often develop insights, strengths, and perspectives that those who haven't experienced such challenges cannot easily understand. Their knowledge, earned through suffering, becomes a form of power that can be used to help others, to change systems, to prevent future harm. Like Medusa's protective symbolism in ancient art, survivor wisdom becomes a force that guards against evil. Contemporary artists working with themes of sexual violence and survival have found in Medusa a powerful figure for exploring the complexity of trauma recovery. She represents the refusal to be reduced to victimhood, the insistence on existing in all one's complicated humanity, the right to be angry, powerful, and transformative rather than simply grateful to have survived. The image of Medusa has also been embraced by various social justice movements as a symbol of righteous anger and the power of the marginalized to resist oppression. Her face appears on protest signs, activist artwork, and social media campaigns as a representation of the fury that emerges when injustice becomes unbearable. When the oppressed refuse to remain silent or invisible, some psychologists and therapists have begun using Medusa's story as a therapeutic tool, helping clients explore their own experiences of trauma and transformation. The myth provides a framework for understanding how terrible experiences can change us, how society may respond to our changes, and how we can reclaim power over our own narratives. Clients can identify with different aspects of Medusa's journey, from the original trauma to the isolation to the eventual reclamation of power. The fashion industry's adoption of Medusa imagery, while sometimes criticized as commercial appropriation, has also played a role in normalizing her image as a symbol of strength rather than fear. When Medusa's face appears on luxury goods, jewelry, and haute couture, it sends a message that femininity can be both beautiful and dangerous, that women can embody power without apology, that the serpentine and the sacred can coexist. Academic feminist scholarship has continued to develop more nuanced readings of Medusa's myth, examining it not just as a story about individual trauma, but as a reflection of broader systems of oppression and resistance. These scholars have traced the evolution of her image across cultures and centuries, showing how different societies have used her story to explore their own anxieties about feminine power, masculine violence, and the relationship between beauty and terror. The digital age has created new opportunities for Medusa's story to be retold and reimagined. Online communities of survivors share their own versions of her myth, create art inspired by her image, and use her story as a framework for discussing their own experiences. Social media platforms have become spaces where the ancient myth intersects with contemporary reality where mythological wisdom meets modern trauma theory. As we near the end of our journey through Medusa's story, it's important to consider what lessons her myth offers us and why her tragedy continues to resonate more than to millennia after it was first told. Medusa's story is not just an ancient curiosity or a relic of primitive thinking. It is a mirror that reflects enduring truths about power, justice, and the treatment of those who survive the unsurvivable. The first and perhaps most important lesson of Medusa's story is the danger of victim blaming and the way that societies often choose to punish the survivors of violence rather than address the systems that enabled that violence in the first place. Athena's decision to curse Medusa rather than confront Poseidon established a pattern that continues to this day. When faced with the choice between challenging power and blaming victims, institutions often choose the path of least resistance. This pattern reveals itself in countless contemporary contexts. The ways that survivors of workplace harassment are quietly transferred or encouraged to resign. The ways that victims of assault are questioned about their behavior, rather than focusing on their attackers. The ways that those who speak out about abuse are labeled as troublemakers or attention seekers, rather than truth tellers. Medusa's curse is still being enacted every day, in boardrooms and courtrooms and school administrative offices around the world. The second lesson of Medusa's story concerns the nature of transformation and the way that trauma changes us. Physical transformation into a monster with snakes for hair is an extreme metaphor, but it captures a real truth about how surviving violence can alter us in ways that make us seem foreign, even to ourselves. The challenge for individuals and societies is learning to see the person who remains beneath the changes, to understand that transformation is not the same as corruption. Modern trauma therapy emphasizes that healing doesn't mean returning to who we were before our traumatic experiences. It means integrating those experiences into a new sense of self that can encompass both the pain and the growth that emerged from it. Medusa's story, read with empathy rather than fear, shows us a woman who was profoundly changed by what happened to her, but who retained her essential humanity beneath her monstrous exterior. The third lesson involves the power of narrative and who gets to tell the story. For centuries, Medusa's story was told by men about a woman, by heroes about a monster, by those in power about those who had been stripped of power. The feminist reclamation of her myth demonstrates the importance of allowing marginalized voices to speak for themselves, to define their own experiences, to challenge the versions of their stories that have been imposed upon them. This lesson extends far beyond mythology into every arena where stories shape reality. In courtrooms, newsrooms, classrooms, and corporate boardrooms, the question of who gets to tell the story and how that story is framed determines not just how we understand the past, but how we shape the future. Medusa's transformation from monster to symbol of strength shows us what becomes possible when those who have been silenced are finally allowed to speak. The fourth lesson concerns the nature of justice and the difference between punishment and accountability. Medusa's story shows us what happens when justice systems prioritize the comfort of the powerful over the rights of the vulnerable. Athena's curse was not justice. It was a political choice disguised as divine judgment. True justice would have addressed Poseidon's crime, not Medusa's survival of it. This distinction between punishment and accountability remains crucial in contemporary discussions of sexual violence and other forms of harm. Accountability involves acknowledging harm, taking responsibility for actions, making amends, and changing behavior to prevent future harm. Punishment, particularly when directed at survivors rather than perpetrators, often serves only to maintain existing power structures and silence those who might challenge them. The fifth lesson involves the transformative power of community and solidarity. While Medusa's sisters, Steno and Euryale, are often portrayed as minor characters in her story, their choice to accompany her into exile represents the crucial role that community plays in survival. No one survives trauma entirely alone. We all need witnesses, allies, and companions who are willing to sit with us in our transformed state. The contemporary movements that have embraced Medusa as a symbol, from #me to various feminist and survivor advocacy organizations, demonstrate the power of collective action and shared narrative. When survivors come together to tell their stories, to support each other, and to demand change, they create the kind of community that Medusa was. Denied in her myth, Medusa's story has proven remarkably durable, returning again and again in new forms across different cultures and centuries. This persistence suggests that her myth touches on something universal in human experience, something that transcends the specific details of ancient Greek religion and speaks to enduring questions about power, suffering, and transformation. In literature, Medusa has appeared in works ranging from Dante's Inferno to contemporary young adult novels, each generation finding new meanings in her ancient story. Writers have used her as a symbol of everything from feminine rage to the power of the repressed, from the dangers of unchecked desire to the possibility of redemption through suffering. Her adaptability as a literary figure reflects the complexity of the themes her story embodies. The visual arts have been similarly drawn to Medusa's image, with artists from Caravaggio to contemporary painters finding in her face a subject that allows them to explore the relationship between beauty and terror, power and vulnerability, the sacred and the profane. Each artistic interpretation reveals something different about both the artist's vision and the cultural moment in which they worked. Cinema and television have offered their own interpretations of Medusa's story, though these have often focused more on her role as a monster to be defeated than on the tragedy of her origin. However, more recent films and television shows have begun to explore her story with greater nuance, presenting her as a complex character rather than a simple antagonist. The digital age has created new opportunities for engaging with myth. Video games allow players to interact with her story in immersive ways. Online communities discuss and reinterpret her mythology, and digital artists create new visual representations that blend ancient symbolism with contemporary aesthetics. These new media forms demonstrate that mythological stories can continue to evolve and find relevance in technological contexts that their original creators could never have imagined. Academic disciplines continue to find new ways to analyze and understand Medusa's story. Anthropologists examine how her myth reflects broader patterns in how societies deal with violence and victimhood. Psychologists use her story to explore trauma and recovery. Art historians trace the evolution of her image across cultures and centuries. Religious studies scholars examine how her story reflects changing ideas about divine justice and human suffering. The persistence of Medusa's story across all these different contexts suggests that it serves a crucial psychological and cultural function. It provides a way for societies to process and understand experiences that are otherwise difficult, to articulate the experience of being violated, transformed, isolated, and ultimately reclaimed. Her myth offers a framework for thinking about how we treat survivors, how we understand trauma, and how we can move from victimhood to empowerment. But perhaps most importantly, Medusa's story serves as a reminder that no narrative is ever final, that every story can be retold, reinterpreted, and reclaimed by new voices and new perspectives. The monster of ancient Greek mythology has become a symbol of feminine power, survivor strength, and the right to define one's own meaning. This transformation of her cultural significance demonstrates that even the most seemingly fixed stories can be changed when we choose to see them differently. The impact of Medusa's story extends far beyond the boundaries of classical mythology, sending ripples through thousands of years of human culture, art, psychology, and social understanding. To fully appreciate the tragic dimensions of her myth, we must examine how her story has shaped and been shaped by the societies that have inherited it, how her image has been used and misused, and how her narrative continues to resonate with contemporary struggles for justice and recognition. In the realm of classical literature, Medusa's story influenced countless other tales of transformation and punishment. The pattern established by her myth, where victims of divine violence are transformed into monsters, while their attackers face no consequences, became a recurring theme in Greek and Roman literature. From Ovid's Metamorphoses to the tragic plays of Aeschylus and Euripides, we see echoes of Medusa's fate in the stories of other women who were punished for being victimized. The psychological implications of Medusa's myth have been explored by scholars and therapists for decades. Carl Jung saw in her image an example of the terrible mother archetype, the feminine principle turned destructive through trauma and betrayal. Freudian analysts have interpreted her serpentine hair as a symbol of castration anxiety, her deadly gaze as the power of the feminine to unmake masculine authority. While these interpretations have been criticized for their male-centered perspective, they demonstrate the profound psychological resonance of Medusa's image. More recent psychological analysis has focused on Medusa as a representation of trauma responses, particularly the way that survivors of violence may develop protective mechanisms that others perceive as threatening or antisocial. Her isolation mirrors the social withdrawal common among trauma survivors. Her deadly gaze represents the hypervigilance that can make intimate relationships difficult, and her transformation speaks to the way that traumatic experiences can fundamentally alter a person's sense of self and their relationship to the world. The feminist reclamation of Medusa has also extended into academic philosophy, where thinkers like Julia Kristeva and Luce Irigaray have used her image to explore questions of feminine subjectivity and the way that patriarchal societies construct and control feminine identity. These philosophers have argued that Medusa's transformation represents not just individual trauma, but the systematic oppression of feminine power and wisdom by patriarchal, religious, and political structures. In the field of religious studies, scholars have traced the evolution of Medusa's myth as part of the broader historical shift from goddess-centered to God-centered religious systems in the ancient Mediterranean. Her transformation from protective deity to destructive monster parallels the demonization of other feminine religious figures, from the Hebrew Lilith to the Celtic Morrigan, as patriarchal religious systems sought to establish their dominance over older, more egalitarian spiritual traditions. The legal implications of Medusa's story have also drawn scholarly attention, particularly in the context of contemporary discussions about sexual assault and victim blaming. Legal scholars have used her myth as a case study in how justice systems can fail survivors by focusing on the behavior of victims, rather than the crimes of perpetrators. The way that Athena punished Medusa for Poseidon's crime mirrors modern legal practices that scrutinize the actions, clothing, drinking, and sexual history of assault survivors. while giving less attention to the behavior of their attackers. The themes embedded in Medusa's story are not unique to Greek mythology, but appear in various forms across cultures and continents, suggesting that her myth touches on universal human experiences of power, trauma, and transformation. By examining these cross-cultural parallels, we can better understand the deeper truths that her story represents and the ways that different societies have grappled with similar questions about justice, victimhood, and the treatment of those who have been wounded by those in power. In Hindu mythology, the figure of Kali bears striking resemblances to Medusa in her transformed state. Like Medusa, Kali is depicted with flowing hair, a frightening visage, and the power to destroy those who oppose her. But unlike Medusa, Kali is revered as a powerful goddess, a destroyer of evil, a protector of the innocent. This difference in interpretation suggests that the same archetypal figure can be understood as either monster or divine protector, depending on the cultural context and the perspective of those telling the story. Japanese folklore includes numerous stories of women transformed into yokai, supernatural creatures as a result of trauma, betrayal, or injustice. The onryo, vengeful spirits of women who died in emotional turmoil, share with Medusa the theme of feminine suffering transformed into supernatural power. Like Medusa, these figures are often portrayed as dangerous to men, but they are also understood as embodiments of justified anger against the systems that failed to protect them. Celtic mythology offers the figure of the Morrigan, a triple goddess associated with war, fate, and death, who often appears in forms that combine beauty and terror. Like Medusa, the Morrigan represents the potentially destructive power of the feminine when it is pushed beyond the bounds of normal social interaction. But in Celtic tradition, this power is respected and feared rather than simply condemned, suggesting different cultural attitudes toward feminine rage and transformation. Native American traditions include many stories of women who are transformed by trauma or injustice into powerful spirits or supernatural beings. These transformation narratives often emphasize the continuing agency and wisdom of the transformed woman, presenting her change not as a punishment but as an evolution into a different kind of power. This perspective offers an alternative reading of Medusa's story that focuses on her gained abilities rather than her losses. African mythological traditions include figures like the Yoruba goddess Oya, who controls the winds and storms and is associated with transformation and change. Like Medusa, Oya is both feared and revered, seen as dangerous but also as powerfully protective. Her mythology emphasizes the necessity of destruction in the process of creation, the idea that sometimes things must be torn down before they can be rebuilt. These cross-cultural parallels suggest that the figure of the transformed woman, the feminine power that has been wounded and changed by that wounding, represents a universal human archetype. Different cultures may interpret this figure differently, as monster or goddess, as villain or hero, but the basic pattern remains remarkably consistent across time and space. The visual representation of Medusa has evolved dramatically over the centuries, and these artistic interpretations reveal changing cultural attitudes toward her story and its meaning. From ancient Greek pottery to contemporary digital art, artists have found in Medusa's image a powerful vehicle for exploring themes of beauty, terror, transformation, and power. The earliest artistic depictions of Medusa found on ancient Greek pottery and architectural elements emphasized her monstrous qualities. These images, dating from the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, show her as a grotesque figure with bulging eyes, boar-like tusks, a protruding tongue, and snakes for hair. Her face was often depicted frontally, unusual in Greek art, which typically showed figures in profile, emphasizing the direct confrontation between viewer and viewed that was central to her mythology. But even in these early depictions, there are subtle signs of the complexity that would later emerge in her artistic representation. Some vases show her in motion, running or flying, suggesting agency rather than static monstrosity. Others depict her death with a certain pathos, showing her sleeping peacefully before Perseus strikes, or displaying the birth of Pegasus and Chrysaor from her blood as a moment of creation rather than mere destruction. During the classical period of Greek art 5th–4th centuries BCE, Medusa's representation began to shift toward greater beauty and humanity. The famous Medusa, Rondinine, a Roman copy of a Greek original, shows her with flowing hair that transforms gradually into serpents, her face beautiful but touched with melancholy. This representation suggests an artistic recognition that there was more to Medusa than simple monstrosity, that her story contained elements of tragedy that deserved sympathy rather than fear. Roman artists continued this trend toward humanizing Medusa's image, often depicting her on shields, breastplates, and architectural elements as a protective rather than threatening figure. The famous Aegis of Athena, with Medusa's head at its center, became a symbol of divine protection rather than divine wrath. This shift in artistic interpretation reflects a broader cultural understanding of Medusa as a complex figure, whose power could be channeled for protection as well as destruction. Renaissance artists rediscovered Medusa through their study of classical sources, but they brought their own cultural preoccupations to bear on her image. Caravaggio's famous painting Medusa, 1597, shows her at the moment of death, her face expressing shock and horror rather than malevolence. The painting, created on a shield, was intended as a protective talisman, but it also humanizes Medusa by focusing on her emotional experience rather than her monstrous appearance. Leonardo da Vinci reportedly painted a Medusa head, now lost, that was said to be so realistic and terrifying that it frightened even its creator. This Renaissance fascination with Medusa reflected broader cultural interests in transformation, illusion, and the relationship between art and reality. For Renaissance artists, Medusa became a symbol of art's power to transform the viewer, to create emotions and reactions through visual representation. The Romantic period brought new interpretations of Medusa that emphasized her tragic dimensions. Artists like Henry Fuseli and Theodore Géricault depicted her not as a monster but as a victim, showing her transformation as a moment of profound loss rather than deserved punishment. These romantic interpretations reflected broader cultural shifts toward valuing emotion, individual experience, and sympathy for the suffering of others. Contemporary artists have embraced Medusa as a feminist icon, creating works that explicitly challenge traditional interpretations of her story. Artists like Judy Chicago, Kiki Smith, and Luciano Garbati have created sculptures, paintings, and installations that present Medusa as powerful, beautiful, and justified in her anger. These works often invert traditional power dynamics, showing Medusa as victorious rather than victimized, as agent rather than object. Scholars have suggested that Athena's curse was actually a form of protection, that by making Medusa dangerous, she was giving her the power to defend herself against future attackers. But this interpretation, while appealing in its attempt to find mercy in cruelty, ignores the devastating cost of such protection. What good is the power to kill if it comes at the cost of everything that makes life worth living? What good is safety if it requires complete isolation from the world. As our journey through Medusa's story comes to an end, we return to where we began, with a woman whose name meant guardian or protectress, who served faithfully in a temple dedicated to wisdom and justice, who asked for nothing more than to live her life in service to something greater than herself. The monster that mythology made of her was never the truth of who she was. It was only what others chose to see when they looked at her. The tragedy of Medusa is not just the tragedy of one mythological figure, but the tragedy of every person who has been blamed for the violence committed against them, who has been transformed by trauma and then punished for that transformation, who has been forced to carry the consequences of others' actions, while those others face no accountability for their crimes. But Medusa's story is also a story of resilience, of the way that even the most profound injustice cannot completely destroy the essential humanity of those who suffer it. Beneath the serpentine hair and the deadly gaze, beneath the curse and the exile and the centuries of misunderstanding, there remains the woman who chose to serve wisdom and justice, who deserved protection and received punishment, who became a monster not through any fault of her own, but through the failures of the systems that should have kept her safe. The feminist reclamation of Medusa's story in recent decades has shown us what becomes possible when we choose to center the experiences of survivors rather than the narratives of those who harm them. When we look at Medusa with empathy rather than fear, when we see her as a person rather than a monster, when we understand her transformation as a response to trauma rather than evidence of evil, her story becomes not a cautionary tale about vanity or divine punishment, but a powerful meditation on survival, strength, and the possibility of reclaiming power from those who would use it against us. The lessons of Medusa's story are as relevant today as they were in ancient Greece. We still live in a world where the powerful can assault the vulnerable with impunity, where victims are more likely to be punished than perpetrators, where survivors are often seen as dangerous or damaged rather than wise or strong. We still live in a world where those who speak truth about their experiences of violence are often silenced, isolated, or transformed into objects of fear rather than subjects worthy of justice. But we also live in a world where Medusa's image has been reclaimed as a symbol of power, where her story has been retold with empathy and understanding, where survivors have found in her myth a framework for understanding their own experiences and an inspiration for their own journeys from victimhood to empowerment. We live in a world where the serpents in her hair can be seen as a crown rather than a curse, where her deadly gaze can be understood as the power to stop those who would do harm, where her isolation can be reimagined as a form of sacred solitude. Rather than punishment, the woman behind the myth was never the monster that others made her into. She was a guardian, a protectress, a survivor who carried the weight of injustice with a strength that even her oppressors were forced to acknowledge. Her story is tragic, not because she became something terrible, but because the world failed to see the terrible thing that had been done to her. Her legacy is powerful not because she was a monster, but because she was a woman who refused to be destroyed by those who tried to destroy her. As we close this exploration of Medusa's story, take a moment to consider the stories in your own life and community who are the modern Medusas, the people who have been transformed by trauma and then blamed for that transformation, who are the survivors who have been made into monsters by systems that refuse to acknowledge their own failures. Who are the voices that have been silenced, the experiences that have been denied, the truths that have been buried beneath more comfortable fictions? Medusa's story reminds us that behind every monster there may be a person, behind every curse there may be a crime, behind every act of divine punishment there may be a profound injustice. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of the stories we tell, to question the narratives we inherit, to listen to voices that have been marginalized or silenced. Most importantly, Medusa's story teaches us that no narrative is ever final, that even the most deeply entrenched myths can be re-examined, reinterpreted, and reclaimed. The woman with snakes for hair and death in her eyes has become a symbol of life, power, and the indomitable strength of those who survived the unsurvivable. In reclaiming her story, we reclaim the possibility that all stories can be told differently, that all voices can be heard, that all survivors can move from silence to speech, from isolation to community, from victim to warrior. The true tragedy of Medusa's story is not that she became a monster, but that it took us so long to see the woman she had always been. The true triumph of her story is not that she was finally defeated by a hero, but that she was finally reclaimed by those who understood her truth. In the end, Medusa's greatest power was not her ability to turn others to stone, but her ability to transform how we see ourselves, our world, and the possibility of justice for all who have been wounded by those who wield power without wisdom, authority without empathy, strength without mercy. Her story is our story. Her tragedy is our tragedy. Her reclamation is our reclamation. And in understanding her truth, we come closer to understanding our own. The woman behind the myth was never the monster. She was always the guardian, the protectress, the survivor whose strength was forged in the fire of injustice and whose legacy burns bright in every act of resistance. Every moment of solidarity, every choice to see the person behind the pain, the survivor behind the story, the woman behind the myth. This is why Medusa's story is more tragic than we thought, and why it is also more powerful than we ever imagined.